On this channel, we have several videos discussing the lead Cenobite and Hell Priest, Pinhead. But we don't have a video that takes a real deep dive into his anatomy. Until today. Please join us as we discuss the anatomical facts about Pinhead. Let's get to it, shall we?
It seems that evil does run in the family.
I always used to think it takes symmetry for humans to look good conventionally. You know, just the right things at the right places. But Clive Barker shook my belief with the introduction of Pinhead as the leader of the Cenobites in his Hellraiser franchise. This guy has the most organized body with the perfectly measured grid of nails and his symmetrical wounds and his calm, deep voice. And yet, there is something so unsettling about him. His appearance is disturbing not because things are out of order, but because they are so out of the ordinary. I think the best way to sum up the unique physique of Pinhead is that he's a twisted religious symbol of pain and suffering, and in this video, I'll dive deep into his hellish anatomy. I'll discuss who he was before he was remade in the hellish dimension, and what the pins really mean, and how his powers work. So, as Pinhead would say, this video will have such sights to show you. Who is Pinhead, and what is his origin story? If you're even remotely familiar with the Hellraiser franchise, you've definitely heard about Pinhead. He is easily the most famous Cenobite, and this extra-dimensional being is often associated as the leader of the Cenobites or the Hell Priest. Also, it's worth noting that the name Pinhead was not used in the first film, which credited him as the lead Cenobite. It was only later that the name Pinhead became the accepted identity. The first movie keeps his origin story under wraps as well, and it is in Hellraiser 3, Hell on Earth, that we get a proper backstory and find out that he was once Captain Elliot Spencer, a British Army officer during World War I. However, the second film already hinted at his past life as a human. He was born in England during the Victorian era in 1887, and during the First World War, he served as a captain in the British Expeditionary Force. He was initially a compassionate man who cared deeply for those around him. But the inhumanity of the war made him lose faith on such feelings. He also lost faith in God and believed that God failed mankind. Spencer suffered from severe PTSD and led a hedonistic lifestyle, prioritizing only his pleasure. And then, he came upon the Lament configuration in British India. This is when he finally understood the true pleasures of pain and suffering. Opening the puzzle brought him into contact with the Cenobites and eventually led to his transformation into the Hell Priest. So what I find particularly interesting here is that even a man as twisted as Pinhead didn't start off as a monster, and the circumstances made him into whatever he became later. Why does Pinhead look more like a ritual than a monster? There is something about Pinhead that makes him one of the most unforgettable horror villains, and I think it has something to do with his design. You see, when I think of a terrifying horror villain, I'm immediately thinking about horrible mutilations and a monstrous appearance. Now, Pinhead might be no Tom Cruise, but his mutilations aren't random, and there seems to be a pattern. His face is a bit too symmetrical, even with all the pins sticking out, and this is because of the set pattern. We have seen many other Cenobites in the Hellraiser universe, such as Chatterer, Butterball, or the female Cenobite, but none of their design is so symmetrical. The clothing of Pinhead resembles ceremonial vestments, and his posture is controlled. Even his behavior is surprisingly calm, which is supported by his voice, and you will end up feeling like he is one of Hell's victims more than a senior Hell Priest. While a Cenobite like Chatterer looks like he has been mutilated beyond recognition, Pinhead simply looks like he has a redesigned face. I've seen that almost all Cenobites have a symbolic transformation, and in this regard, Pinhead's visual symbolism is order. The pain inflicted on him is measured, organized, and almost turned into a religious system, which is probably the reason his appearance seems straight out of a ritual. What did the pins actually do to Pinhead's head? Clive Barker drew inspiration for the Cenobite designs from punk fashion, Catholicism, and by his visits to the S&M clubs in New York and Amsterdam. As for Pinhead in particular, he was inspired by African fetish sculptures, and initially, he had even more extreme plans for the design of Pinhead, with navel piercings indicating genital piercings. The final design is so memorable because it is so unique. You have a grid of pins driven into the skull of Pinhead and also on his face, and these pins are arranged in even rows, which create a checkerboard-like pattern across his scalp. Every intersection is marked with a nail, and this turns his head into a map of controlled mutilation. I find this peculiar arrangement unnerving, and possibly more disturbing than random gore. When you come across someone with such mutilations in a horror flick, the first assumption is an accident. But when the design is so perfect, it implies planning, measurements, and patience. More importantly, it implies that the entire design is a part of a ritual, and whoever went ahead with this wanted every pin in exactly the right place. The pins all over his head and face make Pinhead's skull look exposed, and the regular patterns make the wounds feel mathematical. Pinhead has pale skin and sunken eyes, and this makes the head grid stand out even more. The overall design gives him a sacred, priest-like appearance, and fans will agree that this is far more terrifying than a random feral monster. There are some accounts that describe the arrangement of pins as 64 pins placed across his face and head. But the movies have altered this with time because of different makeup and props. I feel that the most important purpose of the pins so meticulously placed on Pinhead is to serve as a reminder that he does not simply hurt people, but turns inflicting pain into a precise system. How does Pinhead's body function after Cenobite transformation? I've spoken at length about how Pinhead went from being a human to an otherworldly entity, and of course, he no longer functions as a normal human. For starters, he doesn't react to pain or physical injury, and he doesn't experience the normal aging process. As Pinhead, he has no hunger as well, and even death has a different meaning for him than a normal human body. Yes, his physical body can still be damaged, and I will come to this later in the video. But ordinary weapons and the usual human resistance are meaningless against him. There is a disturbing aspect about any Cenobite physiology, and I think it's about the contradiction of it. I mean, these bodies are terribly mutilated in the most horrific ways, but they still continue to function with calm control. Even if I take Pinhead's example here, his wounds are not healing ever, and he literally has pins all over his head and face, but this is his operating state. So after his Cenobite transformation, Pinhead has a few things in common with other Cenobites. For instance, he can appear and disappear between the human world and his own dimension. He is resistant to any form of conventional physical harm, and his body is sustained by supernatural rules and not governed by the rules of human biology. Pinhead can return even after he is seemingly destroyed, which is the same as other Cenobites as well. So, there are some very noticeable changes following his transformation, and even though it is not laid out specifically, the films do not make it seem as if his nerves are dead. He probably has no blood in his system as well, and even if he does, the blood definitely doesn't work like human blood. A regular human would have bled out or died from infection after that many pins are carefully grafted throughout his body. And this is probably the biggest example of Pinhead having a different anatomy altogether. How does Pinhead wield his hooks and chains? Once he's summoned, Pinhead unleashes a ceremony of torture that is unthinkable. He primarily uses chains and hooks as weapons and restrains his victims before subjecting them to insane torture instruments. These chains appear out of thin air with response to his will, and they move with supernatural precision. The chains have the ability to anchor themselves in flesh, bone, and walls or ceilings, as required for the particular victim. One of the signature moves of Pinhead includes hooking a victim and pulling from several directions until the body is mutilated beyond recognition or just ripped apart. I think the creepiest part in all of this is how Pinhead doesn't even need to get his hands dirty for this, and he generally doesn't need to touch the victim at all while the chains perform the torture. In Hellraiser 1987, Frank Cotton opens the lament configuration, and he is immediately attacked by the hooked chains that pierce his body and pull him apart. Toward the end of the film, when Frank tries to attack Kirsty, a chain shoots out through the room, hooks him, and pulls him backward. Then more chains appear and impale him before tearing him apart. Another purpose of the hooked chains is the way they can drag across the body and peel away skin. You can see this in Hellraiser 3, Hell on Earth, where Pinhead's attacks tears off faces and attack multiple people, showing the range of control he has over these supernatural chains. They can break through anything, and there's no stopping these chains once Pinhead wants them moved a certain way. What power does Pinhead actually have beyond the chains? The hooked chains might be his weapon of choice, and even his primary weapon in most cases. But there's more to Pinhead's arsenal. He has teleportation abilities, which is evident from the way he moves between Earth and the Cenobite realm through the Lament configuration and other supernatural gateways. His other supernatural abilities include manifesting objects and altering his surroundings. There have been instances where Pinhead tormented his victims by using a nightmare-like environment, and he can create weapons, chains, and barriers as he wants. He also happens to be a master of deception, and he can take human form or manipulate perceptions to lure the victims into danger. One of his most important powers is that he can transform humans into a new Cenobite, which means that his forces keep increasing as he wants. Pinhead has a great understanding of desire, guilt, fear, addiction, temptation, and any other complex human emotion, and this allows him to use them effectively against his victims to suit his purpose. I feel that his greatest weapon is actually his understanding of the human psyche because he understands what his victim wants before he punishes them for wanting it. How durable is Pinhead? The Hell Priest has mastered pain and lives the twisted life of a Cenobite, so you can imagine he has some extreme resilience. As I have said before, he's completely resistant to normal physical attacks, and the conventional weapons do him no damage. He can withstand abnormal levels of pain, and in fact, he thrives in pain, so wounds inflicted on him are actually no trouble at all. In Hellraiser 3, Hell on Earth, Pinhead is confronted with guns, but it doesn't stop him, and he's completely immune to bullets. I guess this is what separates him from the usual slasher villains as a metaphysical entity. Harming his physical body does not necessarily destroy or affect the entity behind it. What can defeat Pinhead? Well, he cannot be killed as a Cenobite, but there are still ways to defeat him. I think the most straightforward way to get the better of Pinhead is to reverse the Lament configuration, which effectively sends him back to his world. Another way to outsmart Pinhead is to understand his own code of rules and regulations that he strictly abides by. For instance, if the person who summoned him was forced to do so, he doesn't go after the individual. So technically, he can't be tricked into letting go or be forced to leave the human world. In the original Hellraiser movie, Kirsty used the puzzle box to banish the Cenobites after Frank is reclaimed. One of the greatest limits to Pinhead's powers can be seen in Hellbound Hellraiser 2, when Dr. Channard becomes a Cenobite and empowered by Leviathan. He destroys Pinhead and the other Cenobites with his surgical appendages. However, even in this case, Pinhead is not destroyed by guns or human strength, and he is simply overwhelmed by a being who operates at a higher supernatural level. He might be powerful even by Cenobite standards, but he's not superior to Leviathan, the ruler of the labyrinth. Another interesting example that comes to mind is in Hellraiser Bloodline, when the Elysium configuration was designed to close the Hell Gateway permanently, which trapped and destroyed Pinhead in the process. All in all, Pinhead might seem invincible physically, but certain rituals, rules, and configurations can challenge him and lead to his defeat. But with an entity like him, nothing is really permanent, not even his destruction. Can Pinhead recover after being destroyed? There isn't a single answer to this because Pinhead's destruction is largely treated inconsistently across the movies. After all, he doesn't have a regular physical body, and his destruction is not as simple as a human death. For instance, even after his apparent destruction, Pinhead returns through the Pillar of Souls, and this pillar absorbs victims and reconstructs or releases him. Basically, he can make his way back even after he is eliminated, and when his manifestation on Earth is destroyed, it doesn't automatically erase his existence in the labyrinth. Can Pinhead reproduce? Of course we had to go there. I mean, are you telling me you've never wondered if Pinhead has regular urges, or if he can reproduce and create a mini Pinhead? Unfortunately, the answer is probably a resounding no. He is a former human, and as Elliot Spencer, I am sure he could reproduce. But his transformation has altered things. In general, Cenobites are depicted as beings beyond normal biology, and they don't have the usual human reproductive functions. The continuity of numbers comes from humans who are transformed into Cenobites and not from baby Cenobites being born. If I take into account the entire Hellraiser franchise, including movies, comics, and novels, there is not a single instance where Pinhead, or any Cenobite for that matter, has reproduced. Why does Pinhead speak like a priest instead of a slasher villain? Who are some of the most famous slasher horror villains that come to mind? You would probably think of Freddy Krueger or Michael Myers, and none of their mannerisms match with that of Pinhead. Unlike the usual loudmouth killer or the unusually silent ones, Pinhead speaks with the calm certainty of someone who is delivering a sermon. His words from the original film still echo in my head when he said,
"Explorers, further regions experience demons to some, angels to others."
I think the reason that he speaks like this, calm and composed instead of a maniacal slasher villain, is because he doesn't see himself as a psycho killer. He views himself as a guide to sensations that are beyond ordinary human understanding, and his philosophy of pain, pleasure, desire, and punishment comes from a twisted rulebook that he believes in. However, I find this to be scarier than a standard killer because when Pinhead hurts people, he's not overwhelmed by anger or some sadistic satisfaction. For him, it's just about revealing a truth and following some rules. And in a way, he is the voice of Hell, and the enforcer of Hell's ideology and justice. How did Doug Bradley's Pinhead change across 8 Hellraiser films? Nobody, and I repeat, nobody can play Pinhead better than Doug Bradley. And I say this with a due respect to anyone who tried, and those who will fill the shoes in the future. For the fans, Doug Bradley has almost become synonymous with the role, and he has featured across 8 Hellraiser films, so you can understand why we are so used to seeing him as Pinhead. In the first Hellraiser movie back in '87, he was the lead Cenobite, and he immediately became iconic even though the name Pinhead came later. He then returned for the sequel, Hellbound Hellraiser 2 in '88, where it was first revealed that he was once human and the mythology of the labyrinth was expanded. In Hellraiser 3 Hell on Earth, Bradley reprised the role as the central antagonist, and this is where we get the details on Elliot Spencer. The next film was Hellraiser Bloodline 1996, where Pinhead was placed within a century-spanning conflict tied to the Lament Configuration's creator and a future space station. He followed it up with further appearances in movies like Hellraiser Inferno, where Pinhead was a punisher in a detective's personal hell, Hellraiser Hellseeker, Hellraiser Deader, and Hellraiser Hellworld. This one marked the last of Doug Bradley's performance as Pinhead, and even though many of the films that I mentioned may not make it to the classics list, Bradley's acting performance as Pinhead was never under the scanner. It marks the perfect evolution of a role across the franchise as he goes from a supporting antagonist to the main face of the franchise who carries the series on his shoulders. Who played Pinhead after Doug Bradley, and what changed? The movies continued, even though Doug Bradley couldn't, and this meant that new people had to take up the challenge to play Pinhead. In Hellraiser Revelations 2011, Stefan Smith Collins played the role physically, while Fred Tatasciore was the voice of Pinhead. This recasting for a hastily made film was one of the major talking points, and the fans were quick to point out that the franchise now had a major hole to be filled because nobody could match up to the aura of Bradley as Pinhead. The saga continued in Hellraiser Judgment in 2018, which was written and directed by a longtime Hellraiser makeup effects veteran Gary J. Tunnicliffe. He wanted to return the franchise to the Cenobite-focused atmosphere, and Paul T. Taylor was cast as Pinhead. Now, don't get me wrong. Anyone who tried to play Pinhead probably gave it their best shot, and maybe, with all the biasness from having watched Doug Bradley, we would have accepted their performances. It's just that Bradley's voice and mannerism as Pinhead is so deeply etched in my mind that I just cannot get over it. I can't imagine how difficult it must be for those trying to fill in because they have to constantly match up to the legacy. How did Jaime Clayton's 2022 Hell Priest reinvent Pinhead? If I am asked at gunpoint to pick a Pinhead apart from Doug Bradley, I would pick Jaime Clayton. And even though this might be an unpopular opinion, I actually enjoy the 2022 Hellraiser reboot. The movie cast Jaime Clayton as Pinhead, immediately raising a few eyebrows because of the obvious gender change. But you have to understand that the movie ignores the whole Elliot Spencer story, and it is a new version of the character in a rebooted continuity. Also, if you go by the original novella, the lead Cenobite is more androgynous than the distinctly male version of Pinhead that we're used to, courtesy of Bradley. I don't mind the fact that the reboot returns to this ambiguous idea about the gender of Pinhead, and even the design changes work for me. For instance, the nails and ritualized facial structure still remains, but the body appears to be more elongated and skinless than before. The most noticeable change for me is the Cenobite clothing that is integrated into the flesh, and the entire look fits the reboot's idea that the Cenobites wear their own bodies as ceremonial garments. Also, it is worth noting that even with all the changes, the core values of Pinhead remain the same, where the being treats agony as sacred order. What is Pinhead's greatest feat of power? Pinhead has accomplished quite a few remarkable feats, but there's still one that stands out for me, and this takes place in Hellraiser 3 Hell on Earth. Here, once he is released from the Pillar of Souls, Pinhead is no longer limited to appearing briefly as an enforcer of the Lament configuration. He manipulates J.P. Monroe, creates many new Cenobites from ordinary people, and unleashes large-scale destruction through the Boiler Room nightclub. In this version, he is physically free in the human world and commands and creates a new Cenobite force. He causes widespread death and destruction and goes beyond targeting one individual who opens the puzzle box. He is manipulative enough to make humans help his return, and in general, across all movies, this is the most villainous and unrestrained form of Pinhead that we have encountered. If you go by Clive Barker's novel The Scarlet Gospels, there is an instance where Pinhead attempts to take over hell itself by hunting powerful magicians and stealing their secrets. And I think this one is pretty ambitious as well. But if we keep these crazy feats aside for 1 second, I still believe that his greatest accomplishment is the way he turns destruction into a controlled ceremony, where it almost becomes a celebration. I think you now have enough information about Pinhead to have a few solid nightmares, and this twisted character from the depths of a despicable realm is probably one of the most iconic horror villains of all time. I just hope they find a way to retain the charm of this character in the upcoming movies, because Doug Bradley has set the bar very high, and we expect Pinhead to be a certain way because of him. Let me know in the comments down below what you think of the Hellraiser franchise in general, and also share your thoughts on the Hell Priest's unique anatomy. If you appreciate the efforts to bring you this content, please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel for more such videos. Till next time!